London wakes up to moments like this quietly. There are no sirens, no sudden announcements that stop traffic. Instead, there is a short statement, carefully worded, released early enough to shape the day before questions can fully form. It appears on official letterhead. It uses calm language. It speaks of legacy, intention, and respect. And yet, behind those measured words, something unsettled begins to move. The statement, attributed to the household of a long-deceased public figure whose memory still carries weight across generations, confirms that a long-planned inheritance provision has reached a moment of review. It references compassion. It references service. It speaks about hopes once expressed for healing work, especially connected to those harmed by conflict. On the surface, it reads like closure, like the quiet fulfillment of a promise made decades ago. But within hours, a different story begins to circulate, not in official language, but in cautious conversations, in legal circles, in private briefings that never quite make it onto paper. According to public commentary and unconfirmed discussion among those familiar with the situation, access to that inheritance may not proceed as expected, not because it no longer exists, and not because the intended recipient has been removed. Instead, because someone else believes the moment is wrong. At the center of this tension is a family relationship that has long been described as strained but functional. Two brothers, both shaped by the same loss, both publicly linked to the same legacy. Yet now, according to several accounts that have not been formally addressed, one brother is attempting to slow, limit, or possibly block the transfer of funds altogether. The reasoning, as it is being discussed, is not framed as personal resentment. It is framed as protection. Protection of a name, protection of intent, protection of a legacy that some believe is being pulled in directions never envisioned when the original wishes were written. This is where the situation begins to change. What looked like a routine inheritance update starts to resemble a dispute about meaning, about control, about who gets to decide how memory is used. Nothing has been confirmed, no final action has been announced, but as lawyers review documents and trustees weigh discretion against obligation, one thing is clear. This is no longer just about money. It is about whether a legacy meant to heal has instead become something that divides. To understand how the situation reached this point, it helps to step back and look at how the inheritance was originally designed and why it has remained dormant for so long. The estate at the center of this discussion was never meant to function like a typical transfer of wealth. From the beginning, it was structured with caution, shaped by advisors who understood both the emotional weight of the assets and the public scrutiny that would follow any decision connected to them. When the estate was organized in the years following the public figure's death, much of its value was intentionally placed beyond immediate reach. Portions were set aside in long-term trusts. Others were protected through discretionary clauses that allowed trustees to delay or modify distributions if circumstances changed. This was not unusual for estates tied to public institutions. The goal was stability, not speed. At the time, both sons were minors. The documents reflected that reality. They emphasized maturity, responsibility, and timing rather than entitlement. The language used in those early papers focused on stewardship, not ownership. Wealth was described as something to be guided carefully toward purpose, not something to be claimed outright. Those phrases may have seemed abstract then, but they now sit at the center of today's debate. As years passed, the older brother moved steadily into an institutional role. His public life followed a clear path. He remained embedded within the structure that had shaped the estate itself. His responsibilities grew alongside his authority. With each passing year, he became more closely associated with continuity, tradition, and long-term preservation. That context matters now because it informs how he sees his role in decisions connected to family legacy. The younger brother's path was different. He pursued causes shaped by personal experience rather than institutional expectation. His public work often focused on healing, particularly for people affected by conflict and trauma. Over time, he became closely associated with one major charitable initiative that reflected those values. That work earned praise early on and was widely viewed as a meaningful extension of the ideals his mother had once expressed. For many years, these two paths appeared to coexist without direct conflict. The inheritance remained untouched, largely because it was not yet needed. Both brothers had financial security through other means, the estate functi. One as a symbolic anchor rather than an active resource. That balance, however, did not last. As public roles shifted and personal decisions reshaped public perception, the quiet agreement surrounding the estate began to weaken. According to public commentary, concerns started to emerge about how future access might be used. These concerns were not expressed openly at first. They surfaced through private reviews, legal consultations, and internal discussions about risk. One issue frequently mentioned in those discussions was jurisdiction. Portions of the younger brother's life had moved outside the country where the estate was based. This raised questions about how inherited assets could be treated under different legal systems. Some advisors reportedly warned that once funds crossed borders, they could become subject to rules that conflicted with the original intent of the trust. These warnings did not accuse anyone of wrongdoing. They focused on exposure. Another issue involved the blending of personal and public causes. The charitable work associated with the younger brother had expanded into media partnerships and branded projects. While none of this was illegal or hidden, it complicated how the estate's purpose might be interpreted. Trustees are often cautious when assets meant for service risk being entangled with commercial activity. That caution appears to have intensified as financial pressures elsewhere became more visible. This is where timing becomes critical. The current review of the inheritance coincides with a period of financial strain that has been widely discussed but never formally detailed. Publicly available information suggests that several high-profile contracts tied to the younger brother's work have ended or changed terms. Security costs, legal expenses, and property obligations have also been mentioned in media analysis. None of these details have been officially confirmed, but together they have shaped perception. Perception in cases like this can be as influential as fact. Trustees are not only guided by what is proven, they are guided by what could reasonably happen if circumstances deteriorate. This is why discretionary clauses exist. They allow action based on risk, not accusation. At this point, many people started asking questions. Was the inheritance still meant to function as a long-term moral instrument, or had it become a financial fallback? Was the delay an act of control or an act of preservation? And most importantly, who had the authority to answer those questions? The older brother's involvement in the review has become a focal point. Acting in a role that carries institutional weight, he is reportedly advocating for restraint. His position, as it is being described, does not deny the younger brother's connection to their mother's legacy. Instead, it challenges whether current circumstances align with the original spirit of the estate. This framing has proven effective. It shifts the discussion away from sibling conflict and toward responsibility. It suggests that intervention is not about stopping access forever, but about ensuring that access happens under conditions that cannot later be regretted. Whether that argument will prevail remains uncertain, but it has already changed the tone of the conversation. What was once a private family matter has become a broader discussion about how legacy is managed in the modern world. And as that discussion continues, the inheritance itself remains exactly where it has always been, locked, protected, and waiting for a decision that may define more than just one family's future. As this uncertainty settled in, the conversation around the inheritance began to widen. It was no longer confined to legal language or family memory. It moved into public discussion, shaped by commentators who framed the situation less as a dispute and more as a question of direction. What exactly was the inheritance supposed to do now, decades after it was created? According to public commentary, the younger brother has long believed that his charitable work represents a direct continuation of his mother's values. Those close to his initiatives often point to early statements she made about empathy, service, and support for those affected by war. In that sense, the connection feels natural. The work exists, the mission aligns, and from that perspective, access to the inheritance appears justified, even overdue. Yet others view the situation differently. They argue that alignment of values does not automatically justify unrestricted access. In their view, the estate was designed to support healing without becoming a financial engine for broader personal stability. This distinction may seem subtle, but it has become central to the disagreement. Much of the discussion hinges on how the funds would actually be used. While some portion has been described as supporting charitable expansion, there has also been open acknowledgement that the remained could provide personal security. That acknowledgement, while honest, has raised concerns among advisors who see any blending of personal need and legacy funds as a potential departure from intent. These concerns are not accusations. No one has claimed misuse. Instead, they reflect a cautious reading of risk. Trust structures exist to anticipate future complications, not just current plans. Once assets are released, control is difficult to regain. For trustees, that reality carries weight. Another layer of complexity comes from the younger brother's ongoing legal challenges and public disputes. While these matters are separate from the inheritance, they contribute to an atmosphere of instability. Legal actions require funding. Public disputes draw attention. Attention increases scrutiny. From an institutional standpoint, releasing a large sum during such a period could expose the estate to unintended consequences. This is why the idea of a protective arrangement has entered the discussion. Under such a structure, the beneficiary is not denied support. Instead, access is limited to income generated by the trust, while the principal remains protected. This approach is not uncommon in high-profile estates. It is often used when trustees believe the beneficiary may face external pressures that could compromise long-term preservation. Supporters of this approach describe it as balanced. It provides assistance without surrendering control. Critics describe it as patronizing. They argue that it treats an adult as incapable of managing resources, despite years of public service and leadership. The divide between these views reflects deeper tensions about autonomy and trust. At this point, many people began to ask whether the disagreement was truly about money at all. Some observers suggest it is about narrative control. Whoever guides the inheritance also guides how the legacy is interpreted. That influence carries symbolic power, especially when the legacy belongs to someone whose memory still resonates widely. The older brother's position, as it has been discussed, emphasizes continuity. He is seen as guarding not just assets, but an image shaped by restraint and stability. In contrast, the younger brother's approach emphasizes evolution. He views legacy as something that must adapt to remain relevant. Neither perspective is inherently wrong, but they lead to very different outcomes. What followed only added to the confusion. Reports emerged of private communications, emotional appeals, and attempts to gain support from extended family members. These accounts, while unverified, suggest that the situation has moved beyond formal channels. When decisions become personal, resolution becomes harder. Trustees now find themselves under pressure from multiple directions. On one side is institutional expectation. On the other is familial obligation. Their role requires neutrality, yet neutrality becomes difficult when consequences are so deeply human. A decision to delay could be seen as betrayal. A decision to release could be seen as negligence. Meanwhile, the charitable initiatives connected to the inheritance remain in limbo. Expansion plans discussed in public forums cannot proceed without funding clarity. Partners hesitate, donors wait. The very causes the estate was meant to support are affected by the uncertainty. This irony has not gone unnoticed. Commentators have pointed out that a legacy intended to heal is now stalled by internal disagreement. That observation has fueled calls for compromise. Some suggest phased access tied strictly to charitable milestones. Others propose independent oversight to separate legacy funds from personal finances entirely. Whether such solutions will be considered remains unknown. No formal statement has addressed these possibilities. What is clear is that the situation has reached a point where inaction carries its own cost. Delay preserves control, but it also prolongs uncertainty. As days pass without resolution, the inheritance takes on a different meaning. It becomes less about what it can do and more about what it represents. A test of trust, a measure of how families navigate power after loss, and a reminder that even carefully planned legacies can be reshaped by circumstances no one anticipated. This is why the discussion has not faded. It touches on questions that extend beyond one family or one estate. It asks how intention survives time, how memory is protected, and who gets to decide when honoring the past means holding back rather than giving freely. This is where the situation began to feel less theoretical and more like a pattern. Observers who had followed the story casually started noticing how often similar tensions had appeared in recent years, not just around money, but around control, access, and interpretation. The inheritance debate did not emerge in isolation. It followed a series of moments where private family matters gradually became public questions. According to public commentary, earlier disagreements had already reshaped how trust functioned between the brothers. Once, coordination had been informal. Decisions were guided by shared memory and mutual assumption. Over time, that approach gave way to documentation, intermediaries, and legal review. This shift did not happen overnight. It happened quietly as confidence thinned and expectations diverged. People close to the institutional side of the family often describe this change as necessary. In their view, informality works only when interests remain aligned. When public narratives begin to diverge, structure replaces sentiment. That structure, they argue, protects everyone involved, including the legacy itself. Others see the same pattern as evidence of growing distance. They point out that each additional safeguard also creates emotional separation. When everything requires approval, trust is no longer assumed. It must be proven repeatedly. For the younger brother, this has reportedly felt like a steady narrowing of space, not just financially, but symbolically. The inheritance review intensified these feelings. It was no longer about past disagreements or media portrayals. It was about whether the family still believed in his judgment. The suggestion that funds might be released only under strict supervision was interpreted by some as a verdict. even if no such verdict was officially declared. Patterns also emerged in how concerns were raised. They were rarely expressed publicly. Instead, they appeared in indirect ways: a delayed signature, a request for additional documentation, a call for further clarification. Each step could be justified on procedural grounds, but together they formed a clear message. Caution had become the default stance. This cautious approach extended to discussions about charitable branding. While the initiatives associated with the younger brother continued to receive praise, there was growing sensitivity around how they were presented. When charitable work intersects with media production, lines can blur. Trustees and advisors tend to be wary of any scenario where altruism and promotion become difficult to separate. This does not imply wrongdoing. It reflects a fear of perception. In high-profile legacies, perception can alter meaning. What one audience sees as awareness, another sees as exploitation. The risk is not legal exposure alone, but erosion of moral authority. Once that authority weakens, the legacy loses its protective power. The older brother's supporters often frame his actions as a response to this risk. They argue that his role requires him to think beyond personal bonds. As someone positioned within an institution that values continuity, he is expected to prioritize long-term stability over short-term harmony. From that angle, intervening in the inheritance is not a personal decision. It is an extension of duty. This reasoning has gained traction in certain circles. Analysts point out that institutions survive by setting boundaries, even when those boundaries cause discomfort. They also note that many historic legacies have been diminished precisely because no one intervened early enough to protect them from misuse, however unintentional. Still, critics question whether the threshold for intervention has been clearly defined. At what point does caution become control? At what point does protection begin to resemble exclusion? These questions remain unanswered, largely because the criteria guiding the current review have not been made public. What followed only added to the sense of tension. Reports surfaced of the younger brother seeking reassurance from extended family members. These accounts suggest a desire not just for support, but for affirmation that the original bond still mattered. Such efforts indicate that the dispute has emotional depth beyond legal strategy. Extended family members, according to commentary, are divided. Some feel the inheritance should proceed as planned, honoring the original expectation without reinterpretation. Others believe circumstances have changed enough to warrant adjustment. This division has made consensus difficult, leaving trustees in a precarious position. Trustees are tasked with balancing competing obligations. They must honor the wishes expressed in foundational documents. They must also act in the best interest of the estate as it exists today. When those obligations conflict, discretion becomes the tool for resolution, but discretion is inherently subjective. The legal frameworks governing such trusts allow for flexibility, but they do not eliminate moral weight. Every decision sets precedent. Approving full access could signal trust and reconciliation. Restricting access could signal caution and authority. Either choice reshapes relationships. Meanwhile, the passage of time continues to apply pressure. Financial realities do not pause for deliberation. Charitable projects require planning. Staff require stability. Uncertainty affects not only the beneficiaries, but those who depend on the initiatives associated with them. This ongoing delay has prompted some observers to suggest that the situation may never fully resolve. Instead, it could settle into a prolonged state of limitation, where partial access replaces full autonomy indefinitely. Such arrangements are not uncommon in complex estates, but they often leave emotional residue. For the younger brother, the experience reportedly feels like being asked to prove worthiness repeatedly for something he believed was already understood. For the older brother, it may feel like an unavoidable burden, one he did not seek but cannot escape. Each sees himself as acting responsibly. Each believes the other is missing something essential. As these patterns become clearer, public interest has shifted from the inheritance itself to what it reveals about family dynamics under pressure. The story resonates because it reflects a universal tension. How do families balance trust with accountability? How do they honor memory without freezing it in time? The answers are rarely simple. In this case, they are further complicated by visibility, power, and expectation. Every move is watched, every silence is interpreted, and every delay reinforces the sense that something fundamental is being tested. This is not a sudden crisis. It is the result of accumulated choices, layered over years of change. The inheritance review is merely the point where those layers have become impossible to ignore. And as the situation continues to unfold, the patterns suggest that whatever decision is reached, it will leave a lasting mark on how the legacy is remembered. and on how the family moves forward from here. As awareness of the situation spread, the response beyond the family became impossible to separate from the process itself. What had once been a private inheritance review turned into a broader public discussion, shaped not by official statements but by interpretation. Media outlets, commentators, and institutional observers began weighing in, often cautiously, careful not to overstep what could be verified. Still, the sheer volume of attention altered the environment in which decisions were being made. Coverage varied widely. Some reports framed the situation as a natural consequence of long-standing tension, emphasizing personal estrangement rather than legal complexity. Others focused on the mechanics of trust law, explaining how discretionary clauses are designed to protect estates from unforeseen risk. Very few claimed certainty. Most relied on phrases like "according to sources familiar with the matter" or "public records suggest," signaling how much remained unconfirmed. This ambiguity allowed narratives to diverge. In some commentary, the younger brother was portrayed as a figure under financial strain, seeking access to resources he believed were rightfully his. In others, he appeared as a steward blocked by bureaucracy, unable to fully realize charitable ambitions due to institutional resistance. Neither portrayal captured the full picture, but both gained traction among different audiences. The older brother's role was also interpreted through multiple lenses. Supportive voices described him as acting with restraint, stepping in only when he believed the integrity of the legacy might be at risk. Critical voices questioned whether his involvement crossed into control, arguing that institutional authority should not override personal intent. Again, no definitive proof was offered. The discussion remained speculative, shaped by perception rather than fact. Institutional reactions were more subdued. Organizations connected to the charitable initiatives at issue issued carefully worded statements expressing continued commitment to their missions while acknowledging uncertainty around future funding. None assigned blame. Instead, they emphasized patience and process. This restraint was notable. It suggested an awareness that public pressure could complicate rather than resolve the situation. Legal experts invited to comment in the media consistently returned to the same point. Trusts of this nature are designed to adapt. They allow trustees to pause, reassess, and restructure if circumstances warrant. This flexibility is not evidence of misconduct. It is evidence of caution. Whether that caution is justified depends on factors that are rarely visible to outsiders. Public reaction reflected this uncertainty. Online discussion was active but fragmented. Some viewers expressed frustration, believing the delay undermined causes meant to help vulnerable communities. Others argued that protecting a legacy from potential misuse was more important than speed. These debates rarely engaged with legal nuance. They were driven by emotion, loyalty, and long-held opinions about the figures involved. What became clear is that media attention itself began influencing the stakes. Every new article, every opinion piece increased scrutiny. Trustees and advisors are known to be sensitive to public perception, even when decisions are legally sound. The fear of future criticism can encourage conservatism. In this sense, coverage may have reinforced the very caution it sought to analyze. The absence of direct statements from key figures added to the tension. Silence invited interpretation. Each day without clarification allowed speculation to fill the gap. Some commentators viewed the silence as strategic, allowing legal processes to proceed without interference. Others saw it as avoidance, suggesting uncertainty behind closed doors. Without confirmation, neither view could be proven. This environment also affected institutional confidence. Potential partners and donors reportedly hesitated to commit to projects connected to the inheritance until clarity emerged. Even when intentions were clear, uncertainty about funding timelines created hesitation. This ripple effect demonstrated how private disputes can have broader consequences, even when no wrongdoing is alleged. The role of extended family members attracted particular attention. Though few spoke publicly, their perceived influence became a topic of discussion. Analysts speculated about internal alignment, wondering whether consensus was possible or whether divisions would deepen. Such speculation often relied on past behavior rather than current evidence, but it underscored how closely observers were watching. Some media outlets attempted to contextualize the situation historically, noting that disputes over legacy are not uncommon in prominent families. They pointed out that even carefully drafted documents cannot anticipate every future scenario. When circumstances shift dramatically, interpretation becomes necessary. This framing helped move the discussion away from personal blame and towards structural challenge. Still, emotional language persisted in some corners. Words like betrayal and control appeared in commentary, despite the lack of confirmed action. These terms resonated with audiences familiar with previous conflicts. Once introduced, such language is difficult to contain. It shapes expectations, even when later information complicates the narrative. Institutional bodies connected to heritage and philanthropy responded by reaffirming general principles rather than addressing specifics. They spoke about the importance of transparency, accountability, and alignment between intent and execution. These statements were not endorsements of any side. They were reminders of standards that apply broadly, beyond any one case. As weeks passed, the story remained unresolved. Public interest did not peak dramatically. Instead, it settled into a steady hum. This was not a scandal with a single revelation. It was an unfolding situation, one that required patience to understand. That patience, however, was not evenly distributed. For some, the ongoing delay became proof of dysfunction. For others, it became proof of diligence. The same facts supported opposite conclusions. This divergence revealed as much about audience expectation as it did about the inheritance itself. In the background, legal processes continued quietly. Reviews progressed. Opinions were weighed. None of this made headlines, but it mattered more than any article. Decisions of this nature are rarely made under pressure alone. They emerge from accumulation, not reaction. The public and media response, while influential, remains secondary to the central question. How should a legacy be handled when its meaning is contested by those closest to it? Until that question is answered internally, no amount of external commentary can resolve the uncertainty. And so the story continued, not driven by new facts, but by the absence of resolution. In that space, discussion persisted, cautious, speculative, and unsettled. This is why the story continues to hold attention, even without dramatic turns or definitive announcements. It touches something deeper than a legal dispute or a family disagreement. It raises questions about how legacies survive time, change, and conflict, and it does so in a way that feels unresolved by design. At its core, the inheritance represents a moment frozen in intention. It reflects hopes written in a different era, under circumstances that no longer exist. The world has changed. Public life has changed. Even the meaning of charity has evolved. What once functioned quietly through institutions now often unfolds through media, branding, and global visibility. This shift complicates how older intentions are carried forward. Those close to the review process have suggested, in general terms, that this tension between past intent and present reality is driving much of the hesitation. The documents guiding the estate were written with care, but they could not anticipate every future context. Trustees are now tasked with interpreting spirit rather than instruction. Hat responsibility carries risk. For the younger brother, the continuation of the story reflects a personal struggle with belonging and purpose. According to public commentary, he sees the inheritance not as a reward, but as a responsibility he is ready to shoulder. From that perspective, delays feel like doubt. Each pause becomes a question about trust, not just timing. For the older brother, the story continues because stepping back is not an option. His role, as it is often described, does not allow neutrality. Silence could be interpreted as consent. Action, even cautious action, becomes necessary to signal guardianship. In that sense, the ongoing review is not a temporary measure. It is an expression of how he understands his duty. This difference in perspective explains why compromise has been elusive. One side views movement as essential, the other views restraint as essential. Both positions are rooted in values shaped by shared history, but filtered through different responsibilities. Neither can easily yield without feeling they have failed something larger than themselves. The trustees stand between these positions. Their silence has been interpreted in many ways, but it likely reflects the weight of their role. They are not arbiters of emotion. They are stewards of intention. Their decisions must withstand scrutiny years from now, long after current pressures fade. This long view often conflicts with immediate needs. Another reason the story persists is its symbolic reach. It has become a case study in how public legacies are managed in a private context. Institutions, donors, and families watch closely, not because they expect to copy the outcome, but because they recognize the dilemma. When legacy assets are tied to identity, decisions about them resonate far beyond balance sheets. The unresolved nature of the situation has also allowed each side to maintain its narrative. Without a final decision, positions remain flexible. Statements can emphasize principle without committing to outcome. This ambiguity serves as both shield and burden. It protects against premature judgment, but it also prolongs uncertainty. Public fatigue has not fully set in because the story unfolds slowly. There are no abrupt revelations to exhaust interest. Instead, there is a steady accumulation of context. Each new detail, however small, adds another layer. This slow pace mirrors the way institutional decisions are actually made, which lends the discussion a sense of realism. It is also worth noting that the causes connected to the inheritance continue to exist independently of the dispute. Their work has not stopped entirely. This fact complicates any narrative that frames the delay as purely obstructive. Life moves on, even as funding questions remain unresolved. This continuity tempers urgency, but does not eliminate it. Some observers have suggested that the story continues because it reflects an unresolved question about modern responsibility. Should legacy be preserved exactly as intended or adapted to remain effective? This question has no universal answer. It depends on values, risk tolerance, and interpretation. In this case, those elements do not align neatly. The absence of clear resolution also keeps speculation alive. As long as no decision is announced, every potential outcome remains possible. Full access could be granted, a protective structure could be implemented, conditions could be revised, or the review could extend indefinitely. Each possibility invites analysis, and analysis sustains attention. What makes this situation distinct is not the size of the inheritance or the prominence of those involved. It is the way personal history intersects with institutional authority. The story persists because it resists simple framing. There is no clear villain, no obvious solution, only competing interpretations of responsibility. In many ways, the continuation of the story is itself the point. It reveals how legacy is not a static gift, but an ongoing negotiation, one that requires constant reassessment as circumstances change. That negotiation can be uncomfortable, especially when it involves family, but it is also unavoidable. As long as those involved continue to see the stakes differently, the discussion will not settle. Each side believes it is acting in good faith. Each believes the other misunderstands something essential. Until that gap is bridged, the inheritance remains what it has become, not just a resource, but a symbol of unresolved trust. This is why the story has not faded from view. It is not waiting for a verdict. It is unfolding as a reflection of how complex legacies are managed when memory, power, and responsibility collide. As the discussion moves toward a quieter phase, what remains is not certainty, but reflection. The urgency that once surrounded the inheritance has softened into something more subdued, though no less significant. Without a final decision, the story settles into space where meaning matters more than outcome, at least for now. It is worth pausing on what this situation reveals beyond the individuals involved. Legacies often appear simple from the outside: a name, a fortune, a set of stated wishes. But inside, they are fragile structures held together by interpretation. They rely on trust, not just legal wording. When trust weakens, even the most carefully designed plans can stall. The inheritance in question was never intended to be a solution to future problems. It was meant as a gesture, a way to extend values forward in time. That purpose becomes harder to protect as circumstances grow more complex. Modern public life introduces pressures that older frameworks struggle to contain. Media attention, global movement, and financial exposure reshape how intention is carried out. For the brothers at the center of this story, the inheritance has become a mirror. It reflects their differences more clearly than any public disagreement ever could. One sees protection as an act of loyalty to the past. The other sees action as an act of loyalty to the same past. Both claim to honor the same memory. The conflict arises not from opposing values, but from competing methods. This realization complicates any attempt to assign blame. There is no clear moment where the situation turned hostile. There is only a gradual accumulation of caution, misunderstanding, and unresolved emotion. Each step made sense in isolation. Together, they created distance. The role of trustees and advisors adds another layer. Their task is not to heal family relationships. It is to safeguard assets and intent, yet they operate in a human context where every legal decision carries emotional weight. This tension explains much of the delay. Acting too quickly risks misjudgment. Acting too slowly risks resentment. Public reaction has mirrored this complexity. Interest has remained steady but measured. There is curiosity without frenzy, concern without certainty. Many observers seem to recognize that this is not a story that will end with a dramatic reveal. It will likely conclude quietly, through a decision few fully agree with but all must accept. If a protective structure is implemented, it may be viewed by some as an overreach and by others as prudent stewardship. If full access is granted, it may be celebrated as trust restored or criticized as risk ignored. Any outcome will be interpreted through existing beliefs. That reality limits the power of resolution to satisfy everyone. What remains constant is the legacy itself. It exists independently of current disagreement. It is preserved in memory, in charitable work already done, and in the values that continue to inspire debate. In that sense, the inheritance has already fulfilled part of its purpose. It has forced those connected to it to engage deeply with questions of responsibility. The quiet reflection now surrounding the story suggests that many understand this. The absence of spectacle allows for consideration. It creates space to think about how families, especially those under constant observation, navigate inheritance in a world that rarely allows privacy. This story may eventually fade from headlines, replaced by new developments elsewhere, but its themes will linger. They speak to anyone who has struggled with honoring the past while living in the present. They remind us that legacy is not something handed over fully formed. It is something shaped, contested, and carried forward imperfectly. As time passes, the inheritance will either be released, restructured, or remain protected. Whatever happens, it will not erase the questions raised along the way. Those questions are the true substance of the story. They challenge assumptions about entitlement, stewardship, and trust. In the end, the most telling aspect of this situation is not the money or the documents. It is the silence that surrounds them, a silence filled with careful consideration, unresolved feeling, and the weight of memory. That silence suggests that the legacy still matters enough to be treated with caution. And perhaps that, more than any decision, reflects the enduring influence of the person whose wishes began this story. A reminder that some inheritances are not meant to be easy. They are meant to be carried thoughtfully, even when doing so reveals how difficult that task can be.